She was 3 years old, 28 pounds. She had a yellow hair ribbon that her mother tied every single morning, and on the afternoon of September 14th, 1976, she walked out the back door of her family's home in Clover Hill, Virginia, and was never seen again. Not as a child, not as a teenager, not as a young woman. She simply vanished from the earth, the way children in nightmares do, between one heartbeat and the next, in a backyard her parents had always believed was safe. That is not a story about a little girl who wandered off. That is a story about a crime that stole 48 years from an entire family. And the woman, the daughter, who spent half a century living someone else's life without knowing it. It would take nearly 5 decades, 2 generations of investigators, a genealogy database built from the DNA of ordinary people looking for their ancestors, and one retired detective who refused to call a case closed just because the department told him it was, to finally bring Nora Wallace home. Not to a grave, not to a case file, but home. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to Clover Hill, Virginia, in the autumn of 1976. Because to understand what was found, you first have to understand what was lost. Clover Hill was the kind of Virginia town that still believed in itself in 1976. Population just under 4,000, tucked into the Piedmont foothills where the summers ran long and sweet and the autumn came on like a slow fire, turning the maples along Courthouse Road to amber and gold before October had fully settled in. The main street still had a hardware store, a diner, a barber shop with a red and white pole that had been turning since 1948, and a Piggly Wiggly that doubled as a community notice board. People left their screen doors unlocked. Children rode their bikes to the creek without anybody worrying. Neighbors watched each other's kids the way they watched their own gardens, casually, naturally, as a matter of course. Ruth and Earl Wallace had lived on Birchwood Lane since they married in 1969. Earl worked at the tire distribution plant just outside of town, a solid man who coached Little League in the summers and sang bass in the choir at Second Baptist every Sunday. Ruth worked part-time at the elementary school cafeteria and kept a garden in the backyard that by September was still turning out tomatoes and late squash. They had 2 daughters, Deborah, who was 7, and Nora. Nora was the younger one. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn streak. Ruth would say later that Nora could name every bird that came to the backyard feeder by the time she was 2.5. A cardinal, a mockingbird. She'd point and she'd say its name clear as a bell, like it was the most natural thing in the world for a child that small to know. She wore that yellow hair ribbon every day. Ruth bought a whole roll of yellow gross-grain ribbon at the fabric store on the square and cut it fresh each morning. It had become their ritual. It was the last thing Ruth tied before sending her daughters outside to play. She had a green push toy, a plastic lawn mower that made a popping sound when you rolled it across the grass. She loved that thing. She would spend whole afternoons dragging it up and down the yard while Deborah drew hopscotch squares on the concrete near the garage. That was their Saturday afternoon, September 14th, 1976. Deborah with her chalk, Nora with her toy mower. Ruth canning tomatoes at the kitchen counter with the radio on. Charlie Rich was on the radio that afternoon. She would remember that detail for the rest of her life. And Earl at the plant for a half shift that ended at 4. That was the last ordinary afternoon any of them would ever have. At 3:20 in the afternoon, Deborah came inside to use the bathroom. She left Nora in the yard. When she came back out 7 minutes later, Nora was gone. The green push toy was sitting in the middle of the lawn, tipped on its side. The yellow hair ribbon was lying in the dirt near the back fence. That was the detail that stopped everyone who heard it. Not that Nora was missing, that the ribbon was in the dirt. Ruth Wallace would later say that was the moment she knew something was wrong that went beyond a toddler wandering off. Nora never took that ribbon off herself. She didn't know how. The bow Ruth tied was too complicated for a 3-year-old's fingers. Ruth called Earl at the plant. She called 2 neighbors. She searched the yard. She searched the alley behind the fence. By 3:45, she was on the phone with the Clover Hill Sheriff's Department. By 4:15, deputies were on Birchwood Lane. By nightfall, every able-bodied person in a 4-block radius was walking a grid pattern through the neighborhood with flashlights. Nora was not there. 3 days of searching turned up nothing. No sign of her past that fence. No witnesses who had seen a small girl in a yellow ribbon. One neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Pruitt, who lived 2 houses down, told investigators she had seen an unfamiliar vehicle. She described it as a dark green station wagon, older model, parked near the alley fence sometime between 2 and 4 that afternoon. She thought nothing of it at the time. She mentioned it to a deputy on day 2 of the search. And the information was written in a notebook that would sit in a box for 31 years. The lead investigator assigned to Nora's case was Deputy Sheriff Harold Givens, 34 years old, with 8 years on the force and a 2-year-old daughter of his own at home. Records from the Chesterfield County Sheriff's Office confirm that Givens treated the Wallace case as a top priority from the first day, interviewing 43 residents of Birchwood Lane and the surrounding blocks in the first 2 weeks alone. He was methodical. He was thorough. And he was working with the tools available to law enforcement in 1976, which meant no forensic databases, no DINA, no centralized National Missing Persons Registry, and no way to circulate a child's description beyond a flyer printed at the newspaper office and a notice in the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Early suspicion focused on a man named Gerald Tate, a twice-convicted sex offender who had been released from Pocahontas Correctional Center 14 months before Nora disappeared and was living in a rooming house on the edge of Clover Hill. Givens interviewed Tate twice. He had an alibi for the afternoon of September 14th. He had been seen by multiple witnesses at a gas station 12 miles away, and had held up under scrutiny. Givens eliminated him as a suspect in October 1976. Tate died of a heart attack in 1989, and his name was struck from the file. There were other leads. An anonymous tip about a man who had been seen talking to children at the Piggly Wiggly. A report of a crying child heard in a car near the Route 360 interchange. Each one was followed. Each one went nowhere. By the spring of 1977, with no body, no witnesses, and no physical evidence beyond the yellow hair ribbon, which the lab in Richmond could not connect to anyone, the active investigation slowed to a crawl. By 1979, Deputy Givens had been moved to other assignments. The Wallace file was placed in storage. Ruth and Earl Wallace never stopped looking. Ruth called the sheriff's office every month for 11 years. She mailed photographs of Nora to newspapers in 3 states. She taped up flyers in the rest stops along I-95 and I-81. She kept the yellow hair ribbon in a small wooden box on her dresser. Earl, by all accounts, turned inward. He stopped singing in the choir. He stopped coaching Little League. He and Ruth held together for 9 years before the marriage broke apart quietly in 1985. The way things do when a grief is too heavy and too unshared to carry jointly anymore. By 1990, 14 years had passed. Deborah Wallace was 21, living in Richmond, studying accounting at night school. She carried her own private version of the loss, the guilt of having come inside to use the bathroom, the 7 minutes, the ordinary thing she had done that she could never stop turning over in her mind. The case file sat in a storage room at the Chesterfield County Sheriff's Office, along with hundreds of others. The neighbor, Mrs. Pruitt, had passed away in 1984. The barber shop on Courthouse Road had closed. The Piggly Wiggly was a dollar store now. By 1997, 21 years had passed. Ruth Wallace had remarried and moved to Roanoke. She still kept the box on her dresser. She still called the sheriff's office, though by now she was talking to people who had joined the department after Nora disappeared and had to pull the file to remember what she was calling about. By 2008, 32 years had passed. A young deputy named Marcus Ellison, newly assigned to the cold case unit that Chesterfield County had formed with 3 officers and a part-time civilian administrator, pulled Nora Wallace's box from storage as part of a systematic review of unsolved cases from the 1970s. Ellison read the file, read Mrs. Pruitt's original statement about the dark green station wagon, and noted in his report that the lead had never been fully developed. He flagged the case for follow-up. The follow-up was assigned. Then the budget was cut. The cold case unit lost one of its 3 officers. The file went back into storage. There are families waiting for answers who will tell you, the hardest thing is not grief. Grief you can hold. The hardest thing is watching the world move forward while you stay still. Watching people forget what you cannot forget. Watching a year become 2 years, become 10 years, become 30 years, and knowing that somewhere the answer exists, and it simply hasn't found you yet. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Your support makes this possible. Now let's get back to Nora. In 2021, a woman named Carol Whitfield drove from her home in Asheville, North Carolina, to a DNA testing center in Charlotte and submitted a saliva sample to a consumer genealogy database. She was 51 years old, a retired schoolteacher, a mother of 2 adult sons. She had been raised by a couple named Donald and Annette Whitfield, a quiet, private family who had lived in a series of rented houses in western North Carolina. Donald Whitfield had worked construction. Annette had worked in laundry services at a hospital. They had died within 18 months of each other in 2017 and 2018. Carol had always known she was adopted. Donald and Annette had told her so when she was 8 years old. What they had told her, what she had believed her entire life, was that her birth mother had been a young woman who couldn't care for her, and that she had been placed through a private arrangement when she was a baby. She had never searched for her biological family. She had a life she loved. But after Donald and Annette died, something shifted. She was 50 years old, and she had no medical history. She submitted the DNA test for practical reasons, she would say later. She wanted to know if there was anything in her background she should tell her doctor. She uploaded her results in the spring of 2022 and waited. In the fall of 2022, Deborah Wallace, who is now 53 years old, still living in Richmond, still carrying the accounting career she had built, and the private grief she had never fully set down, submitted her own DNA sample to the same genealogy database. She had done it at the urging of a volunteer cold case organization called Virginia Unresolved, whose members had been advocating for Nora's case to receive a formal forensic genealogy review. The organization had also pressured the Chesterfield County Sheriff's Office to submit what little physical evidence remained from 1976, a partial fingerprint lifted from the fence post near the backyard, and a few cells recovered from the yellow hair ribbon itself, preserved in the wooden box that Ruth Wallace had kept on her dresser for 46 years. The hair ribbon went to a lab in Reston, Virginia, in December 2022. The technicians who worked on it were using mitochondrial DNA sequencing, a process that extracts genetic material from the cellular roots of hair or fabric contact, to build a biological profile from samples that traditional forensic methods would have dismissed as too degraded. The process, explained simply, reads the molecular signature left behind by a living person on an object they touched, and searches for matching sequences in a database of millions of profiles. It is, in effect, a way of asking the evidence, who were you near? On a morning in March 2023, a forensic genealogist named Patricia Howe was reviewing a set of newly matched profiles when a flag appeared on her screen. A sample from an evidence item logged under case number CV 1976-0489, Chesterfield County, Virginia, had returned a familial match to a profile in the consumer database. A strong match. A first-degree match. Patricia Howe picked up the phone and called Marcus Ellison, who was by then the lieutenant in charge of Chesterfield County's expanded cold case unit. She read him the case number. There was a pause on the line. "Pull that file," she said. He already had it open. The match led to Carol Whitfield in Asheville within 72 hours. It was Deborah Wallace's submitted DNA that made the connection possible. A sibling match strong enough that the genealogists confirmed it before any detective had made a single call. Lieutenant Ellison drove to Asheville with a victim advocate from the county's Family Services Division and a colleague from the Virginia State Police Cold Case Division, Detective Sergeant Yvonne Harlow, who had been working Virginia's most complex unsolved cases for 19 years. The meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room at the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office. Carol Whitfield sat across the table from Marcus Ellison and Yvonne Harlow and was told, in plain and careful language, that the DNA evidence indicated she was very likely the biological sibling of a woman named Deborah Wallace from Clover Hill, Virginia, and that she might, in fact, be a person who had been reported missing as a child in 1976. She asked them to say it again. They did. Court documents filed in Chesterfield County in the spring of 2023 confirm what followed. Carol Whitfield's full DNA profile was compared against the evidence samples from the 1976 case file, including the cellular material recovered from the yellow hair ribbon. The match was conclusive. Carol Whitfield was Nora Wallace. She had been taken from her family's backyard at the age of 3 and raised under a different name, in a different state, by people who had known exactly what they were doing. Donald Whitfield had died in 2017. He could not be questioned. But investigators working the financial and documentary trail that emerged from the case determined that he had acquired Carol, Nora, through what the warrant described as an unlawful private transfer in late 1976, likely facilitated by a third party who has since been identified but was deceased before the investigation concluded. The dark green station wagon that Mrs. Pruitt had seen on Birchwood Lane on the afternoon of September 14, 1976. The detail, written in a notebook and left to sit in a box for 31 years, was traced through historical registration records to a vehicle owned by a man connected to Donald Whitfield's work crew. That man had died in 2003. The investigation was closed as solved in the summer of 2023, without any living defendants to charge. Deborah Wallace got the phone call on a Tuesday morning. She was at her desk at the accounting firm where she had worked for 26 years. She has said in interviews that she didn't remember sitting down on the floor of her office, but her colleagues later told her she had. She was on the floor when they found her. She had her hand pressed flat against the carpet, as if she needed to feel something solid. Nora was alive. Her sister was alive. They met for the first time in nearly half a century on a warm afternoon in May 2023, at a neutral location arranged by the Victim Services team, a conference room in Richmond that someone had put flowers in, yellow flowers, though no one has confirmed whether that was intentional. Ruth Wallace, who was 81 years old and living in a care facility in Roanoke, was told by Deborah before the meeting. By all accounts, Ruth said very little. She asked only one thing. Did Nora know she had been loved? Investigators told her. Yes, she was told. She knows. The reunion between Deborah and Carol, between Deborah and Nora, was private. Neither woman has given media interviews. What is publicly documented, in the case summary filed by the Chesterfield County Sheriff's Office, is that both women voluntarily participated in the investigative process, that Carol Whitfield has not changed her legal name, and that the two sisters have been in contact since May 2023. Harold Givens, the deputy who worked the original investigation in 1976, is 80 years old and lives in Henrico County. He was notified of the resolution by Lieutenant Ellison personally. A local reporter who reached him by phone quoted him as saying, simply, "I always believed there was an answer. I just ran out of time to find it." He didn't run out of time. It found him. Nora Wallace was 3 years old when someone took her from a backyard in Clover Hill, Virginia, on a September afternoon in 1976. She had a yellow hair ribbon and a green push toy, and a sister who came back outside 7 minutes later and has spent her entire adult life living with that gap. For 48 years, her family did not know if she was dead or alive, suffering or at peace, whether she had been loved or had been lost in ways no one could imagine. The answer, when it finally came, was complicated in the way that truth after that many years will always be complicated. Carol Whitfield, Nora Wallace, had been given a life. A real one. Not the life that was hers by right, not the name that was hers from birth, not the family that had searched and waited and kept a yellow ribbon in a wooden box for half a century, but a life nonetheless. What she does with the knowledge of who she is and who her family is belongs to her now. That is hers. Nobody took that. What this case tells us is something that investigators and families already know, but the rest of us sometimes forget. Evidence does not expire. A hair ribbon kept on a dresser for 46 years still had something to say. A neighbor's notebook entry from 1976 still mattered in 2023. Time buries things, but it does not erase them. And the technology that exists now, that ordinary people use to find their distant cousins and their grandparents' homelands, is the same technology that gave Deborah Wallace her sister back. There are, according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, more than 600,000 missing persons reports filed in the United States every year. Most are resolved quickly, but thousands are not. And for every case like Nora's, there is a box of evidence sitting in a storage room somewhere, waiting for the right person to open it, at the right time, with the right tools. That is not a reason for despair. It is a reason to keep asking. Here is what I'd like to know from you. Do you believe that Carol Whitfield, who has lived 51 years as herself, with her own name and her own history, should be considered a victim, or a survivor, or something else entirely? And what does it say about our justice system that the man most responsible for this crime died before any court could hold him accountable? Is the resolution of a case like this still justice, even when there is no arrest, no trial, no sentence handed down? Leave your thoughts in the comments. These questions deserve more than one answer. Justice found Nora Wallace after 48 years. Stories like hers are why this work matters. If you believe that truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting for you in the description below. Thank you for being here.